They found the first bone in the ashes. A charred splinter no longer than a thumb lay in the gutted mouth of the fireplace. A survivor of the Great Charleston Fire of 1891 that had eaten 12 city blocks and left the city shivering in daylight. The laborers had come to clear the ruin, brick by stubborn brick, when the pry bar punched through plaster that rang hollow. Behind the wall they found a recess. In the recess, a trunk. In the trunk, a leather-bound journal that smelled faintly of whale oil and old rain. 47 procedures. The first page recorded in a hand so neat it could have been engraved. 47 human subjects. 0 survivors. By the time the city inspector reached the site, the workers had fallen silent, as if sound itself might call something back into the open. The journal's pages were slick with the care of a meticulous mind. Dates and pulse rates, fever charts, tissue descriptions. Margins trimmed with a draftsman's patience, a tone so sterile it froze the air. In those columns lay years, not just nights. Names reduced to numbers. A plantation northwest of Charleston called Belmont. And a physician who never wrote the word mercy. To understand the dead ink, you must go back to the year 1847, when Charleston wore 2 faces. In the old squares, gentlemen debated auscultation and chloroform. At the wharves, barrels sweated molasses in human grief. The medical society, proud since 1789, gathered under chandeliers to toast progress, and, on the same streets, the markets sold progress its meat. It was a city that could recite Galen and count a man like a ledger. Dr. Silas Thornwell arrived with Edinburgh vowels and letters from London men who signed their names like seals. He was 34, his hair already thinning, his hands famous almost at once for their quietude. In conversation, his eyes did not wander. They tunneled. Whatever the subject, catarrh, calomel, the fever season, he turned it toward a single bright idea, the replacement of what was failing with what was fresh. A heart for a heart, a lung for a lung, the way a joiner swaps a rotten beam. In 6 months, he purchased Belmont, a troubled rice plantation with a rotting grand house, an overseer's cottage, 42 enslaved people, and a debt that sang like mosquitoes. He told them through his newly hired overseer, Virgil Rayburn, neck like an ox yoke, that the fields would lie quiet. Belmont would become a medical facility, he said. He let the word facility sit in the air, gleaming and undefined. He gutted the overseer's cottage to its ribs and remade it to a drawing only he could read. Windows lifted on the north to drink a steady light. The central room became a theater no spectator would ever enter. A white oak table with 6 leather cuffs. Iron rings in the floor, iron rings in the beams. For fever, he explained, when the carpenters paused with their hammers in midair. To one side he built a recovery room whose beds wore their straps like belts. To the other, pens stout enough for hooves and hands, carved with channels that remembered where blood runs. A covered passage stitched the pens to the theater, so that what bleated and what begged could move without being seen. When the workmen asked why a surgeon required stalls, he smiled with the patient courtesy of a man already drafting his footnotes. Anatomy is a comparative art, he said. A lamb can teach us as much as a man. He bought animals not as a farmer buys, but as a gambler. 2 fine hogs, 3 broad-chested sheep, and, for a price that made the harbor whisper, a chimpanzee led ashore by a sailor whose eyes had never seen a jungle. He hung lamps bright as winter. He oiled his instruments until they winked. The people at Belmont watched the building rise with the steady dread of those who live by watching. They saw the chain of doors that barred from the outside. They heard the sounds at night when the wind carried everything it could carry. They watched the doctor eat alone. They watched his journal always in his hand, as if the book wrote him back. Among them was a woman named Denina, 42 that winter, the healer of their hollow, keeper of roots and waters and the small mercies that had survived the whip. She had learned, under a previous master, to be necessary and invisible at once. She could tell a man's temper by the way he folded a napkin. She could tell his future by the way he looked at a child. Of Dr. Thornwell, she said in the warmth of the cooking house to her daughter Clara, that man got death in his eyes. Not wrath, not heat. Cold. Like he already wrote it down, and all that's left is to live to the ink. Clara, 20 and round with her first child, took her mother's hand. We keep our heads down, Mama. You can't duck a storm you sleep inside, Denina said. On February 20th, 1847, The first subject walked into the theater believing he was walking toward relief. His name was Augustus, 31. A cough he could not shake, a body still strong enough to lift a gate. Rayburn told him the doctor would treat him for free, a word like sugar on the tongue. They fed him whiskey salted with poppy and called it medicine. When the drowse came, the leather sang shut. Thornwell had spent the day sharpening his steel and his theory. In the journal he wrote with the confidence of a man binding the future. Subject 1. Male. Approx. 31. Respiratory decline. Hypothesis. Replacement of diseased lung tissue with porcine equivalent. Donor. Juvenile pig, 6 months, vigorous. What followed was not medicine. It was hypothesis weaponized. Ether had not been shown at the Massachusetts General Dome. Pasteur had not taught the world its invisible kingdom. Blood knew nothing of types, and Thornwell, who knew all that he did not know, called it courage to proceed. He worked fast but not fast enough. He wrote the result with tidy cruelty. Expired at 11:47 p.m. hemorrhage, respiratory failure. Methodology promising. Before dawn, Rayburn buried Augustus in the row of trees where the land sloped toward water and silence. The doctor changed his coat. The pigs wore their absence like a rumor. They killed him, Dinina told the circle that night. They killed him quiet. She did not say the rest. That quiet killing requires more hands than one man can offer. Pearl went next, a young woman whose heart had stuttered under the weight of breath. Then a boy, then a man, sheep and pig, kidney and lung, sometimes a graft, sometimes a theft. Each entry reduced a life to a measurement. Each burial taught the dirt another name. The enslaved learned to hold coughs behind their teeth. Children practiced looking well. Some men cut their fingers careless on purpose, believing broken meant safe. There was no safe. By March, fear had cured them of sleep. On March 12th, Thornwell came for the woman who had tried to read him. "For your stomach," Rayburn said, hands uneasy in their own skin. "Doctor says you got a complaint." Dinina kissed Clara's head, pressed her daughter's palm to a hidden packet of herbs, and walked with what dignity can be carried into a room built for erasure. She lasted till dawn. In his book, the doctor recorded her last words without comment, as if cataloging a specimen's final twitch. "God see you." Grief sharpened Clara like flint. The baby pressed at her ribs. The world pressed from every side. She went to a white minister with a good reputation and a smaller courage and told him, with careful breath, that people were dying in the doctor's house for reasons that were not God's. He promised to inquire. He did not. Men like him preferred fog to fire. The same month, Dr. Edmund Whitlock, who had always found Thornwell's eyes too still, began to ask for a visit. He wrote letters to the medical society in a physician's hand that knew how to be polite and relentless. A supply merchant named Finch noted his order book darkening with laudanum and needles broad enough for cattle. A man named Isaac ran toward Georgetown and was dragged back with the truth in his mouth. His words were written down and laid aside because words from certain mouths were always put aside. Thornwell wrote, and refined, and wrote. 19 entries became 20. He decided the problem was not his steel or skill, but the subjects themselves. Poor diet, inadequate housing, constitution too weak, he wrote, abandoning even the pretense of cure. If he could find the strongest, he might find success. He selected Benjamin, a carpenter with a back like a beam and hands that knew how to make houses stand. 4 days he lived. 4 days was a triumph in the book. Then the number changed and a hole was dug. On May 3rd, Clara delivered a daughter with the help of the women, whispering her mother's name into the new mouth, Dinina. The joy was a candle cupped against a gale. Thornwell's attention turned toward her as the weeks unspooled, a young woman who had made it through childbirth like a ship through chop. Subject 27, he wrote, noting her pulse with a proprietor's care. When Rayburn came for her in June, Clara did not go quietly. She begged to nurse the baby once more, to leave the child with enough warmth to last the night. Thornwell watched her grief as if it were a symptom. Temperament a variable, he wrote afterward, irritated by what he could not strap down. She died with the morning light on her face. The baby died 3 days later of grief, of hunger, of all the invisible causes that go unrecorded because rooms like that one were built to erase the witness. That double death cracked something in the remaining 16. 4 men, James, Henry, William, Peter, chose a danger they could name over the one that waited in the door. Patrol caught 3. Peter ran until his chest went to glass. He fell through the door of a lawyer who sometimes remembered his own oath and told the story in gasps. The nights with no screams because the doctor drugged the voices, the groans, the dirt. The lawyer carried him to the sheriff, Daniel Patterson, a man with a badge and a temper that preferred evidence to rumor. He agreed to ride out, though he wrote excess mortality in his notebook because certain phrases were safer than others. He sent word of his visit as the law required. Thornwell read the notice and began the housekeeping of a guilty man, scrubbing what wood can be scrubbed, moving animals to distant barns, unscrewing what bolts he could without unbuilding the room. The journal he slid behind a false wall as if paper could be persuaded to forget. Patterson did not come alone on June 20th. He brought deputies, a magistrate later, and Whitlock with a jaw like a decision. They walked the theater. They counted the rings. They traced the channels in the floor with their eyes. For delirium, Thornwell said. For comparative anatomy, words like cloth laid over a body that would not sit still. Patterson asked to speak with the enslaved privately, without the doctor, without the overseer. In the kitchen, with the door closed, a woman named Ruth told him what could be told without getting someone killed. People went in. They did not come out. They heard sounds like pain with its mouth covered. The burials were always before dawn. Some of those chosen had been well. 5 voices braided a rope. At its end swung one question. "Where is your journal, doctor?" Thornwell feigned loss, then theft. Whitlock's face did not change. "I have never seen you without it," he said. Men do not misplace the thing they use to convince themselves. The next morning, Thornwell, sleepless and suddenly committed to his own legend, placed the journal in the sheriff's hands. "Read," he said with a fanatic's calm. "History will vindicate me." History did not. The magistrate read and found not science but a taxonomy of cruelty. The law, crooked tool that it was, found charges it could hold: destruction of valuable property, criminal malpractice, gross cruelty. In a courtroom made for men exactly like the defendant, 12 property owners listened to Ruth describe a hunter who wrote before he killed. The defense tried to pull truth apart with the same fingers that had stitched flesh. The journal sewed it back together. On August 18, 1847, they pronounced him guilty. 15 years of hard labor, a fine, a license revoked. 29 people dead at Belmont in those months. The statute could not say murder, but the ground knew the right word. The survivors were sold and scattered because that is what a system does when it is caught. It disperses the evidence into other ledgers. Belmont's theater was ordered burned by the legislature in 1852, the brick foundation salted with indifference. The journal, this very book, was, by public proclamation, consigned to flames. But a quiet man with a conscience, Edmund Whitlock, swapped volumes in the last hour and hid the true one behind his own wall, where it noosed the years until the fire of 1891 tore the city open and, by accident, told the truth. By then, the country had traded one kind of sin for other kinds, and men with titles finally called the thing by its name. A legislative inquiry took testimonies from Ruth and from a man named Thomas, who remembered a physician's gaze measuring how much life could be spared for the sake of a note. The report said what needed saying, that Belmont was not the work of a single hand but of 1,000 signatures, that science without ethics is only appetite, that the law, if it counts a person as property, will always do its sums in blood. There is a marker now. In a county park where dogs run and children throw sticks and the air is ordinary. It says, Belmont Plantation, 1846-1847. Site of medical experiments that resulted in the deaths of 29 enslaved people. It names the few we can lift from the paper: Augustus, Pearl, Danina, Samuel, Clara, Benjamin, and admits we lost the rest to numbers. As for the ledger itself, it lies in a climate-controlled vault, its leather still oiled by the hands that once loved it more than any living thing. Scholars turn its pages with gloves and hold their breath against the smell of whale and winter. They say correctly that Thornwell's work taught nothing that time would not teach without slaughter, that organs will not tolerate strangers, and that blood hates to be surprised. The only knowledge the book contains is not medical. It is the temperature at which a human being can freeze his soul and still feel warm enough to write. What remains are questions that do not yellow. How many rooms like that were built and burned? How many journals fed to fire without a hand to rescue them? How often do laws make cruelty tidy? And how do we teach a surgeon, Any surgeon, any scientist, any person with a bright idea and a steady hand to keep the first oath first. Near the end of the ledger, in a margin that had once been clean, there is a line that looks like an afterthought, as if the writer's hand slipped and caught itself in confession. It reads, "If posterity condemns me, it is because they enjoy the results without having paid the cost." But the cost was not his to pay. The cost had names and mothers and songs that were sung only once. The cost was a woman who said, "God see you," and walked into the cold with her head high. The cost was a daughter who lived just 3 days in a world her mother had already left. The cost was 29 graves that needed no headstones to be true. And still, if you stand in that park at dusk with the sun reddening the live oaks and the marsh sighing like breath, you can imagine the theater as it was. The table, the straps, the bright, terrible light. You can imagine the journal open to a fresh page, the pen lifted for a number that should have been a name. Then, if you are honest, you will feel the question turn and look at you. What would you have done if the door had swung open and the doctor had said your suffering was necessary for a future you would never see? The first bone lay in the ashes. The rest we carry,